Section 10 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 6. Manners, Part 2. In 1392, Richard II wanted to borrow £1,000 from the Londoners. However, they not only refused, but killed a certain Lombard who would have lent the sum. The king was very angry and deposed the mayor, imprisoning him in Windsor Castle, and the sheriffs and various prominent citizens in other prisons. Finding that they were in a bad case, the citizens repented and offered the king £10,000. Richard, learning that the Londoners were in heaviness and dismayed, said to his men, as Stowe tells us, quote, "I will go to London and comfort the citizens, and will not that they any longer despair of my favour." End quote. On leaving Sheen, he was met on Wandsworth Common by 400 of the citizens on horseback, clad in one livery, who, in the most humble manner, craving pardon for their past offences, besought him by their recorder to take his way to his palace at Westminster through the city of London. The request having been granted, the king pursued his journey to Southwark, where, at St. George's Church, he was met by a procession of the Bishop of London and all the religions of every degree, and above 500 boys in surplices. At London Bridge, a white steed and milk-white palfrey, both saddled, bridled, and caparisoned in cloth of gold, were presented to the king and queen. The citizens received them standing in their liveries on each side of the street, crying, "King Richard! King Richard!" Handsome presents were made to the king and queen, who proceeded to St. Paul's. After the offerings had been made there, the mayor accompanied the king to Westminster. On the following day, the citizens again went to the palace with presents, and received a new confirmation of their liberties. They had, however, to present a golden tablet of the story of Edward the Confessor for the shrine of that royal saint, and were further mulcted in a heavy tax. 7 years after this, the principal actors were changed, and Henry, Duke of Lancaster, approached London with Richard as a captive. He was received in great pomp by the mayor, aldermen, and sheriffs, and all the several companies in their formalities, with the people incessantly crying, "Long live the good Duke of Lancaster, our deliverer." On the 13th of October in the same year, 1399, Henry went in great pomp from the Tower to Westminster, and there was crowned. In 1413, Henry V passed in procession from the Tower through London to Westminster, where he was crowned. But though there was a brave show on this occasion, it was as nothing to what was provided to do honour to the king's return from the glorious field of Agincourt in 1415. The mayor and aldermen, apparelled in orient-grained scarlet, and 400 commoners in murrey, well mounted, with rich collars and chains, met the king at Blackheath, and the clergy of London in solemn procession, with rich crosses, sumptuous copes, and many censers, received him at St. Thomas of Waterings, a place on the Old Kent road, which Chaucer's pilgrims passed when they had gone about 2 miles from the Tabard. At the entrance of London Bridge, on the top of the tower, stood a gigantic figure, bearing in his right hand an axe, and in his left the keys of the city hanging to a staff, as if he had been the porter. By his side stood a woman of scarcely less stature, intended for his wife. Around them were a band of trumpets and other wind instruments. The towers were adorned with banners of the royal arms, and in the front of them was inscribed Civitas Regis Justitiae. Henry V made another triumphant entry into London with his bride, Catherine of France, who was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 14th of February 1421. On the 31st of August following, the king died in France. On the 14th of November 1422, the infant Henry VI was carried through the city to the Parliament at Westminster on the lap of his mother, who sat in an open chair. On the 6th of November 1429, the young king was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The coronation was a very imposing ceremony. At the commencement of the proceedings, the Archbishop of Canterbury made proclamation at the four corners of the scaffold on which the king sat. He spoke as follows, quote, "Seres, here cometh Harry, King Harry the Fifth is son, humility to God and Holy Church, asking the crown of this realm by right and descent of heritage. If ye hold you well pleased with all and will be pleased with him, say you now, yea, and hold up your hands." End quote. Then all the people with one voice cried, "Yea, yea." Henry VI was crowned in France on the 7th of December 1431 by Cardinal Beaufort, his uncle, Bishop of Winchester, and on his return to England he was met at Blackheath by the mayor and citizens on the 21st of February 1431 to 1432. The mayor and aldermen were dressed in scarlet, and the members of the guilds in white, with the cognizances of their crafts on their sleeves. The figure of a mighty giant with a drawn sword stood at the entrance of the bridge. When the king had passed the first gate and was arrived at the drawbridge, he found a goodly tower, hung with silk and cloth of Arras, out of which suddenly appeared three ladies, clad in gold and silk, with coronets upon their head, of which the first was Dame Nature, the second Dame Grace, and the third Dame Fortune. On each side of these dames were 7 virgins, all clothed in white. Those on the right presented the king with the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost: sapience, intelligence, good counsel, strength, cunning, pity, and dread of God. Those on the left with the 7 gifts of grace: the crown of glory, the scepter of clemency and pity, the sword of might and victory, the mantle of prudence, the shield of faith, the helmet of health, and the girdle of love and perfect peace. On Cornhill was a tabernacle of curious work, in which stood Dame Sapience, and around her the 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. At the conduit in Cornhill was set a circular pageant, on the summit whereof was a child of wonderful beauty, apparelled like a king, upon whose right hand sat Lady Mercy, on his left Lady Truth, and over them stood Dame Clemency embracing the king's throne. At the conduit in Cheap there were formed several wells: the well of mercy, the well of grace, and the well of pity, and at each a lady standing who administered the water to such as would ask it, and then the water was turned into good wine. A little further west was a tower ornamented with the arms of England and France. By its side stood 2 green trees, one bearing the genealogy of St. Edward, and the other that of St. Louis. On entering St. Paul's churchyard, Henry VI was met by a procession of the dean and canons, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and 6 bishops, who conducted him to the cathedral, where he made his oblations. He then took horse at the west door of St. Paul's, and so rode to Westminster, where he was received by the abbot and taken to St. Edward's shrine. His lords then conveyed him to his palace, and the mayor and citizens returned joyously to London. This was probably the most elaborate and beautiful pageant ever performed in the streets of London. The king married Margaret of Anjou in 1445, and on approaching London, on the way to her coronation, the queen was met on Blackheath by the mayor, aldermen, and sheriffs, and the principal members of the guilds, attired in brown-blue, with embroidered sleeves and red hoods on their heads, every craft having its cognizance, who brought her with great triumph to Westminster. There were, on this occasion, several pageants of a similar character to those described before. In 1461, after the Battle of Mortimer Cross and the Second Battle of St. Albans, Edward, Earl of March, came to London with his forces and was chosen king in St. John's Field, Clerkenwell, on March 2nd. King Edward's title was set forth in the sermon at St. Paul's Cross by the Bishop of Exeter. After the sermon, the king was conveyed in procession to Westminster Abbey, and after having offered at St. Edward's shrine, he went to Westminster Hall and, sitting in the royal seat, was greeted with shouts of "Long live the King." He then returned to St. Paul's and was lodged in the bishop's palace. On the 26th of June, the mayor and aldermen in scarlet and the commons in green brought Edward IV from Lambeth to the Tower, and on the 28th inst. He was crowned with great solemnity at Westminster. Quote, "And on the morrow, after the king was crowned again in Westminster Abbey in the worship of God and St. Peter, and on the next morrow he went crowned in Paul's Church in London, in the honour of God and St. Paul, and there an angel came down and censed him, at which time was so great a multitude of people in Paul's as ever was seen in any days." End quote. On Whitsunday, 1465, Queen Elizabeth Grey was crowned at Westminster Abbey, having on the preceding day ridden in a horse litter through the chief streets of London, preceded by the newly created Knights of the Bath, 4 of whom were men of London, the mayor and 3 others. Shortly after the murder of Henry VI in the Tower, 1471, Edward was met by the mayor, aldermen, and citizens about a mile from the city, between Islington and Shoreditch, and in the highway he knighted the mayor, 11 aldermen, and the recorder. Edward IV died on April 9, 1483, and his young son, Edward V, was brought from Ludlow by the Greys, his relations on the mother's side. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, fearing the action of the Greys, overtook the procession and sent Earl Rivers and Sir Richard Grey prisoners to Pontefract. Edmund Shah the mayor, the sheriffs and the aldermen in scarlet, with 500 horse of the citizens in violet, met the king and the duke at Hornsey, and, riding from thence, accompanied them into the city, which was entered on the 4th of May. The king was lodged in the bishop's palace, where a great council was held, at which the Dukes of Gloucester and Buckingham and other great lords were sworn. Edward V was deposed soon after this, and on the 5th of July, the day before his coronation, Richard rode from the Tower through the city with his son, the Prince of Wales, 3 dukes, 9 earls, 22 viscounts and barons, 80 knights, esquires and gentlemen not to be numbered, besides the great officers of state. After the Battle of Bosworth, Henry VII was met at Hornsey on the 28th of August 1485 by the mayor, Sir Thomas Hill, and the aldermen in their scarlet robes, accompanied by a great number of citizens on horseback, in violet-coloured gowns, whence they conducted him to Shoreditch, where he was received by the several companies, and then conducted to St. Paul's, where he offered 3 standards, one with the image of St. George, another with a red, fiery dragon, and the third with a dun cow. After the singing of the Te Deum, he went to the bishop's palace. Less than a month afterwards, Sir Thomas Hill died of the sweating sickness. The coronation of Henry VII in 1485 was hurried over with less ceremonial than usual, and without any procession through the city, but that of the Queen, Elizabeth of York, in 1487, was attended with all the pomp customary on similar occasions. On Friday before St. Catherine's Day the Queen came from Greenwich by water. The mayor, sheriffs, and aldermen, with citizens chosen from every craft in their liveries, were waiting on the river to receive her and attend her to the Tower. On the following day she went through London to Westminster in a litter. The houses were dressed with clothes of tapestry and arras, and in cheap with rich cloth of gold, velvet, and silk. Along the streets, from the Tower to St. Paul's, stood in order all the crafts of London in their liveries, and in various places were placed singing children, some arrayed like angels, to sing sweet songs as the Queen went by. The Battle of Bosworth we have agreed to consider as the period of the break-up of the Middle Ages, but it was many years after this before the shows and amusements of the people exhibited any great change. The Tudors, especially Henry VIII, showed a particular delight in pageantry, and the Stuarts carried on the tradition. In fact, it was in Elizabeth's reign that special attention was given to the arrangement of the Lord Mayor's pageant. George Peele, the dramatist, is the first on the list of the city poets, although we have already seen that Lydgate was employed to write poetry in honor of King Henry VI. The pageant prepared for the triumphant passage of, quote, King James and Queen Anne, his wife, and Henry Frederick, the Prince, end quote, from the Tower through the city on the 15th of March, 1603 to 1604, were of a magnificent character. 7 beautiful arches of triumph were designed by Stephen Harrison, joiner and architect. These were erected at the expense of the livery companies and the foreign merchants. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the art of pageantry was almost entirely lost. The decoration of our streets on joyful occasions has lately considerably improved, but there is still room for a more artistic treatment. With our knowledge of the past and the possession of artists who are enthusiastic for the revival of a true taste in pageantry, there ought to be no difficulty in the production of pageants that would do honor to our city. It would be well if the authorities would consult with artists for the improvement of the Lord Mayor's show. We have treated of out-of-door amusements, and must now say a few words on one of those enjoyed indoors. Music and poetry were cultivated by certain foreign merchants in England, who established in London, at the close of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, a society or brotherhood of the Puy, quote, in honor of God, Our Lady Saint Mary, and all saints, both male and female, and in honor of our Lord the King, and all the barons of the country, and for the increasing of loyal love, and to the end that the city of London may be renowned for all good things in all places, and to the end that mirthfulness, peace, honesty, joyousness, gaiety, and good love, with infinity, may be maintained. End quote. The majority of the members were foreigners, but Englishmen were not excluded, for we find that John de Cheshunt was the 3rd prince or president. Statutes and full particulars of proceedings are given in Liber Customarum, and curiously enough, no other evidence of the existence of such a fraternity in England is known. From this document, we learn that the society had received from the city great privileges in respect of the chapel of St. Mary in Guildhall, which was building towards the close of the reign of Edward I. Hence, the donation in its favour for a chaplain by Sir Henry Lewales, 1299, who had been mayor both of London and Bordeaux, and in the latter capacity would be likely to feel an additional interest in this musical society of French merchants and their English friends. The regulations are very full and explanatory of the various proceedings at the Festival of the Puy, as the following extracts from Mr. Riley's translation of the Latin original will show. As to the yearly election of a prince, quote, the prince ought to be chosen as being good and loyal and sufficient upon the oath of 11 companions, or of the 12, to their knowledge, upon their oath, that the Puy may be promoted thereby, and maintained and upheld. And he who shall be chosen for prince may not refuse it upon his oath. And when the old prince and his companions shall leave to make a new prince, at the great feast the old prince and his companions shall go through the room from one end to the other, singing. And the old prince shall carry the crown of the Puy upon his head, and a gilt cup in his hands, full of wine. And when they shall have gone round, the old prince shall give to drink unto him whom they shall have chosen, and shall give him the crown, and such person shall be prince. End quote. Marriage, death, and burial of the members. Quote, If there be any one of the companions who marries in the city of London, or who becomes a clerk priest, he ought to let the companions know thereof, and each shall be there according to his oath, if he have not a proper excuse. And the married person ought to give them chaplets, all of one kind, and all the companions ought to go with the bridegroom to the church, and to make offering, and to return from the church to the house. And if there be any of the companions of the brotherhood who departs this life and dies, all the companions ought to be there, and to carry the body to church by leave of the kindred, and to make offering. End quote. Common hutch. Quote, there shall be a common hutch of the company of the Puy, in which the remembrances and the revised provisions of the company shall be placed in safe keeping. Of which hutch, in the first place, the new prince, each year after he is chosen, shall have one key, and two companions, by assent of the companions, for such custody chosen, each one key, and that this hutch shall stand in such safe place as the companions shall ordain within the city of London. End quote. Clerk and chaplain. Quote, there shall be a clerk, intelligent and residing in London, chosen by the companions, to serve the company, and that he be willing and able to be attendant upon, and obedient unto the prince, and to the 12 companions, in all matters that concern the company. That there be a chaplain at all times singing mass for the living and the dead of the company, and a chapel, founded in honour of God and Our Lady, so soon as the improved means of the company, by the aid of God and good folks, may thereunto suffice. And if the companions of the Puy who are of sufficient means be pressed by illness, so much as to wish to make their testaments, the prince is to go, with 2 of the 12 companions with him, to visit the sick persons, and is to remind them of their faith which they have pledged unto the company, and to admonish them to devise somewhat of their property towards supplying the chapel and chaplain aforesaid, and supporting the same. End quote. The Grand Feast. Quote, whereas the royal feast of the Puy is maintained and established principally for crowning a royal song, inasmuch as it is by song that it is honoured and enhanced, all the gentle companions of the Puy by right reason are bound to exalt royal songs to the utmost of their power, and especially the one that is crowned by assent of the companions upon the day of the great feast of the Puy. Wherefore it is here provided, as concerning such songs, that each new prince, the day that he shall wear the crown, and shall govern the feast of the Puy, and so soon as he shall have had the blazon of his arms hung in the room where the feast of the Puy shall be held, shall forthwith cause to be set up beneath his blazon the song that was crowned on the day that he was chosen as the new prince, plainly and correctly written, without default. As to the serving up the feast, it is also ordained that all the companions shall be served amply, as well the poorest as the richest, in this form. That is to say, they shall be served with good bread, good ale, and good wine, and then they shall be served with pottage, and with 1 course of solid meat, and then after that with double roast in a dish and cheese without more. End quote. No ladies present. Quote, although the becoming pleasance of virtuous ladies is a rightful theme and principal occasion for royal singing, and for composing and furnishing royal songs, nevertheless it is hereby provided that no lady or other woman ought to be at the great sitting of the Puy, for the reason that the members ought hereby to take example, and rightful warning, to honour, cherish, and commend all ladies at all times, in all places, as much in their absence as in their presence. End quote. Costume and procession. Quote, the prince ought, at his own cost, to be costumed with coat and surcoat without sleeves, and mantle of 1 suit, with whatever arms he may please, at his own free will, so that at the election of a new prince, at the great feast of the Puy, he give his mantle and his crown to the new prince, so soon as he shall be chosen. He who shall be crowned for his song upon that day may ride between the old prince and the new one in the procession on horseback which they shall make throughout the city, after the feast, that they may have knowledge of the one prince and of the other by the suit of the costumes. Forthwith, after they have given the crown to him who shall sing the best, they shall mount their horses and make their procession through the city, and shall then escort their new prince to his house, and there they shall all alight, and shall have a dance there, by way of hearty good-bye, and they shall then take one drink and depart, each to his own house, all on foot." End quote. The fraternity took its name from Le Puy-en-Velay in Auvergne, the celebrated statue of the Virgin Mary in the cathedral of which place was long a popular object of pilgrimage and devotion during the Middle Ages. Monsieur Aymard, administrator of the city of Le Puy-en-Velay, and the historian of the Confrérie de Notre-Dame de Puy, is of the opinion that the document in the Liber Customarum is at once more full and more ancient by far than any set of regulations of a similar French fraternity which is known to have survived to our times. Societies of the Puy flourished in Normandy and Picardy. The place of the meeting of the companions is not known, but Mr. Riley suggests that it was possibly in the Vintry. There is some uncertainty as to how the fraternity came to an end. Londoners were better supplied with eating-houses than their neighbours on the Continent, as we learn from the description of the street of cook-shops on the Thames side by Fitzstephen. Quote, "There is also in London, on the bank of the river, amongst the wine-shops, which are kept in ships and cellars, a public eating-house. There every day, according to the season, may be found viands of all kind, roast, fried and boiled, fish, large and small, coarser meat for the poor, and more delicate for the rich, such as venison, fowls, and small birds. If friends, wearied with their journey, should unexpectedly come to a citizen's house, and, being hungry, should not like to wait till fresh meat be bought and cooked, meanwhile some run to the riverside, and there everything that they could wish for is instantly procured. However great the number of soldiers and strangers that enters or leaves the city at any hour of the day or night, they may turn in there if they please, and refresh themselves according to their inclination, so that the former have no occasion to fast too long, or the latter to leave the city without dining. Those who wish to indulge themselves would not desire a sturgeon, or a bird of Africa, or the godwit of Ionia, when the delicacies that are to be found there are set before them. This, indeed, is the public cookery, and is very convenient to the city, and a distinguishing mark of civilization." End quote. Mr. Riley points out in his introduction to the Liber Customarum that the coquina of Fitzstephen was in reality a cook's row, not merely a solitary cookshop. In Fitz Aylwin's Second Assize, 1212, the cookshops on the Thames were ordered to be whitewashed and plastered, and the inner partitions to be removed, from which it would appear that lodging-rooms had been, quote, "constructed for the harbouring of guests and travellers in contravention of the city regulations, which at all times during the 13th and 2 succeeding centuries strictly forbade cooks and pie-bakers to keep hostels for the entertainment of guests. In the 14th century, however, most of these cookshops had made way for genuine hostels and herbergeries, to be kept only by freemen, and on no account by foreigners, though we find mention made of 1 or 2 cookshops lingering on the city margin of the Thames so late as the reign of Edward III. End quote. Mr. Riley adds in his glossary, quote, "To the celebrity which London gained at an early period for its cookshops, its citizens were not improbably indebted for their nickname of Cockney, one which they have retained throughout England to the present day. The earliest recorded instance of its use is probably of this same period. The rhyme uttered, according to Camden, by Hugh Bigot, Earl of Norfolk, in reference to Henry II, the capital of whose English dominions was London. Were I in my castle of Bungay, upon the river of Waveney, I would no care for the king of Cockney. Keepers of wine taverns and alehouses and victuallers, who merely sold provisions, do not appear to have lodged their guests any more than the cooks. The persons whose business it was to receive guests for profit appear to have been divided into two classes, the hostelers and the herbagers. The line of distinction between these two classes is not very evident, but it seems not improbable that it consisted in the fact that the former lodged and fed the servants and horses of their guests, while the latter did not. At all events, hostelers are mentioned as supplying hay and corn for horses, but herbagers never." End quote. Hostelers were also forbidden to sell drink and victuals to any other than their guests. The established charge for a night's lodging about the time of Henry IV was 1 penny per night. Quote, "In the times of our early kings, when they moved from place to place, it devolved upon the marshal of the king's household to find lodgings for the royal retinue and dependents, which was done by sending a billet and seizing arbitrarily the best houses and mansions of the locality, turning out the inhabitants, and marking the houses so selected with chalk, which latter duty seems to have belonged to the sergeant chamberlain of the king's household. The city of London, fortunately for the comfort and independence of its inhabitants, was exempted by numerous charters from having to endure this most abominable annoyance at such times as it pleased the king to become its near neighbor by taking up his residence in the town." End quote. By an act, 7 Edward VI, 1553, 40 taverns and public houses were allowed in the city, and 3 in Westminster. End of chapter 6. End of section 10.